So, am I ready to go, Rebecca? Welcome, everyone, to our Roundtable, Ukrainian Women and the War. We are so delighted that you are here. My name is Melissa Stockdale. I am co-director with Dr. Emily Johnson of OU's new Romanov Center for Russian Studies. The center has organized this roundtable with generous sponsorship from the Department of International and Area Studies in the College of International Studies and the Department of Women's and Gender Studies. We thank them for their support, and we also thank Ms. Stephanie Sager, who has taken care of all of the technical issues. We are still working to get one of our panelists in who's having a little bit of a technical problem. We hope very much that we can resolve this quickly and have her join us. But what I will do now is briefly introduce to you each of our distinguished panelists and then hand it over to my colleague, Dr. Rebecca Cruz, who will moderate the discussion, make comments, and then handle the Q&A. So I am going to start with Dr. Oksana Kiss, who is a feminist anthropologist and historian of women, and a senior research fellow at the Institute of Ethnology of the National Academy of Sciences of Ukraine, based in Lviv. Dr. Kiss's recent book, Survival as Victory, Ukrainian Women in the Gulag, which was published by Harvard University, received a prize from the Peterson Literary Fund in 2021. And this year, she is a visiting professor of anthropology at the Anthropology Department of the New School of Social Research in New York City. Our second panelist I'll be introducing is Dr. Marta Havrishko, who is a research associate at the Ukrainian Academy of Sciences and is currently a fellow at Basel University. In 2018, her book, Overcoming Silence, Women's War Stories, published by Kharkiv, she published her book. She is the author of numerous articles about gender and the dimensions of World War II and the Holocaust, and her current book project is on sexual violence during the Holocaust in Ukraine. The third panelist I'm introducing is Dr. Cynthia Buckley, who is a professor of sociology at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, and an adjunct research professor at the Population Studies Center at the University of Michigan. A social demographer, she explores the cumulative effect of individual demographic choices on socio-political stability. She's the author of numerous articles, and her most recent publications include work on challenges to Ukraine's healthcare center. I'm going to go ahead and introduce our fourth panelist, Jessica Zajkovic, and I'm sure I mispronounced that, I apologize, who is the executive director of the Fulbright programs in Ukraine and the Institute of International Education. Dr. Zajkovic received her most recent monograph, Superfluous Women, Art, Feminism, and Revolution in 21st Century Ukraine, was a recipient of 3 book prizes, including the Omelian Pritsak Book Award at Harvard University. She's also the author of numerous articles. And finally, my distinguished colleague, Professor Rebecca Cruz, who is an associate professor of international studies and the associate dean of student services in the College of International Studies. She specializes in security studies and comparative politics with a focus on issues of security, community development, international organizations, post-conflict resolutions, and gender. She's published articles in international politics and other journals, and her current book project is Eastern Efficacy, Female Political Participation in Post-Communist Europe. And I hand it over to Professor Cruz.
Well, thank you, Dr. Stockdale, so much for that introduction. And I think we have all of our panelists now, so we should be ready to go. Just by way of basic introduction, I think we all know how we got here, but it is worth noting, of course, that it is currently February. And about a year ago, we were sitting here watching as troops were massing on the Ukrainian border. But despite that warning, and certainly despite the Russian-backed insurgency that started in 2014 on the eastern side of Ukraine that left 2.6 million refugees and IDPs, I think the actual invasion last year took many by surprise. And it seemed like the weeks and months afterwards, many of us were glued to our TVs, to social media and other things, trying to understand what was happening. Here we are about to mark a year since that invasion, and perhaps the media attention has waned somewhat beyond the actual area, but obviously the war continues and people are in dire need, and there are all sorts of things going on in the country. And so it's incredibly appropriate and important that we bring these issues back to light. And so we're very, very excited to have not only our panelists, but so many of you joining us here to have this discussion. Throughout the first year of the war, again, just reiterating, we know that an estimated 8.10 million people fled Ukraine, and as many or more were internally displaced. And while everyone in the area has been impacted, we know that women in particular have been impacted in very unique ways. They represent the majority who fled, along with children and older individuals. We also know that while there is no female conscription, a number of women either returned or stayed and are fighting on the so-called front lines. And some of those women and many others are in the grassroots levels to provide support and resources to serve their families and their nation in a variety of ways. As is true in all circumstances, the reality of women in wartime is nuanced, contradictory, complicated, and crucial. We also know that despite all of these factors, these issues remain largely under-nuanced in the media and understudied. Thankfully, our panelists will help us shed some light on the lived experiences of Ukrainian women in wartime, and we're so excited to have them here. We'll start with hearing from Marta Havryshko, who will start with talking about sexual violence during the Russian invasion and the ways in which women's bodies became a battlefield unto themselves. We'll then turn to Cynthia Buckley, who will talk about the refugee and displaced experiences of women and others. And from there, we'll turn to Jessica Zayovich and Oksana Kiss, who will address the ways in which women have worked to safeguard their culture in a variety of different ways. After we hear from our guests, we really want to open this up to you, the listeners and the viewers. So in the Q&A, you will have an opportunity to pose some questions. We'll take those at the end, and we'll try to address as many of those as we can. So without much more ado, let me just turn it over to our distinguished guests. So Marta, please.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. Let me share my screen. So do you see it?
Yes.
Yes, great. So first of all, I want to express my deep gratitude to organizers of this wonderful roundtable. I also want to express my solidarity with all Ukrainian people today who are still suffering from brutal Russian aggression. And I want to stress that in contrast to many Ukrainian scholars, I feel really privileged because I'm safe, my children are safe, and I can continue my research and not think about, interruption of electricity. I have hot water, I'm safe, and it's very, very important to keep in mind that many of our colleagues are still not safe in Ukraine. So please be aware that my topic will be dedicated to very sensitive issues. So please take care about yourself during my presentation. So first of all, I want to stress that first cases of sexual violence perpetrated by members of Russian military appeared right after the occupation of Crimea and part of Donbas region. And most of those cases were related to places of detention, to prisons, torture chambers, and others. and other places. Here you see Alisa Kovalenko and Irina Dovgany, the prominent Ukrainian women who became the voices of many women in Ukraine nowadays who are suffering from sexual violence connected to Russian aggression. Alisa Kovalenko survived the attempted rape in 2014, and Irina Dovgany was raped by members of Russian battalion Vostok, and her daughter was threatened with rape. Now Irina Dovgany is the voice of many women. She is trying to keep her work and help other women survivors of sexual violence. She is currently leader of Zema Ukraine. After 24th February last year, the sexual violence became widespread and really became a weapon, an instrument of Russian aggression against Ukraine. As of today, the Office of Prosecutor General is investigating 155 cases of sexual violence, many of them related to sexual violence against men and boys. I want to point out that sexual violence is present in all temporarily Russian occupied territories, different territories, all basically territories which were occupied or are still occupied by Russians. And the topography of sexual violence is very wide. Sexual violence is taking place in homes of survivors, in shelters, at the checkpoints, infiltration camps, places of detention, torture chambers. In this slide, you see the most common forms of sexual violence: rape, threats of rape, forced into sexual assaults on other people, sexual slavery, forced nudity, sexualized torture, forced penetration with objects, castration, penectomy, genital mutilation. After 24th February, we observe new patterns of sexual violence. First of all, gang rape, when several men, who in many cases belong to one unit, are trying to use sexual violence in order to punish, terrorize, to assert their power and domination over local population. Also, one of the common features of this violence is the public rape, when rape is performed as an performative act, basically. And in this regard, in this kind of rape, perpetrators demand audience. That's why many cases of rape and sexual violence is perpetrated in front of relatives, including children, in front of beloved ones, neighbors, and fellow detainees. And those cases, in many of those cases, men are trying to protect their women, and in those cases, they are killed. Also, many survivors suffer physical violence, brutal physical violence, and many of them are killed afterwards. Also, we know that sexual violence is perpetrated not only against women, but also against and the men, but also against children. And as of today, the youngest survivor is 4-year-old child. Among survivors, we also have elder women, 80 plus. Many of survivors of sexual violence are men and boys. And this violence includes, first of all, sexual torture in places of detention. Effects of sexual violence are both immediate and long-term effects. They affect daily life, self-perception, feeling of security of many survivors. This woman, Victoria, was raped by a Russian soldier, and here you see her quote from one of the interview. And she's constantly repeating that sexual violence destroyed her mentally, and she survived, and she experiencing flashbacks and painful memories. But also many women are trying to deal with suicidal thoughts, especially after gang rapes. Not only survivors themselves experience suicidal thoughts and they are trying to take their lives, but also their children. We know the case of Natalia from Kherson Oblast, who was raped in front of her 15-year-old son, and her husband was killed. So this son, now she's safe outside Ukraine, but still she experienced so many effects of this violence, and her child is experiencing suicidal thoughts. One of the biggest problem and challenge for Ukrainian women connected to unwanted motherhood. Especially, it's troubling for those women who are still are under occupation. So they're really afraid to report what happened to them and to seek medical support. But also those who ended up, for example, in Poland with the strict legislation concerning abortion, they really experience problems with exercising this basic right for abortion. And we know from previous genocides, including Rwanda, Yugoslavia, and Holocaust, that for many women, to carry a product of rape is very similar to torture. That's why for many women, it's a huge issue. I believe and I claim that sexual violence perpetrated by Russian military is real instrument of war against Ukraine. Why? Because it's systematic and widespread. Because we have instigation and encouragement from commanders from above, and they share this responsibility for sexual violence. Also, we observe in some cases limited punishment or absence of punishment at all. Russian soldiers are enjoying impunity, and it became some sort of tradition of impunity. We know that Russian soldiers, members of Red Army, who committed brutal sexual crimes during World War II in Hungary, in Germany, were celebrated as heroes. Many of those committed sex crimes in Afghanistan and Chechnya were not held accountable. Also, I believe that some commanders are trying to turn the blind eyes to sexual violence of their subordinates, because they are trying to use all means in order to fulfill their military and political goals. And when we observe, I'm constantly asked by many people, did you see some orders? We don't need orders to recognize sexual violence as instrument of war, because we can just analyze the political and media discourse in Russia around the problem of sexual violence. On the high top political level, Russian politicians are denying any cases of sexual violence, even they are not trying even to address this question and open some investigation about well-known perpetrators who are trying to disseminate their videos of brutal sexual violence against Ukrainian soldiers through their social media channels. So let me say a couple of words about the bright side of all these issues. Many survivors of sexual violence can obtain holistic support. I mean psychological, legal support, social support in centers, for example, established by United Nations Population Fund in Ukraine, that opened the survivor relief centers in Zaporizhia, Kyiv, Lviv, and Chernivtsi. For the first time from the beginning of Russian invasion from 2014, in Ukraine, in the Western Ukraine, basically was opened a shelter for survivors of sexual violence related to war. Many organizations like Zema Ukraine that I mentioned before are trying to help women. Also was established national psychological hotline for women, but also for men, established in the fall in previous year. Organizations like Eurofem, Жіночі перспективи, Сильні, Lastrada Ukraine are trying to provide psychological and legal support to survivors and their family members. Ukrainian members of Ukraine Parliament are trying to change legislation and to make punishment for sexual crimes related to war more harsh. And they created a special war group and are trying to make these amendments to Ukraine laws. Also, very active agent of change nowadays is the Office of Prosecutor General of Ukraine, and it collaborates with UN, International Criminal Court, Human Rights Watch, Justice Rapid Response Roster, and other organizations who are trying to share their knowledge, their experience, and try to help Ukraine to develop this survivor-centered approach and this holistic help for survivors. And I want to stress that first, rape trials are now we observe forced rape trials now in Ukraine. For example, Ruslan Kuliyev, a 30-year-old Russian military man, was charged with threatened rape of 16-year-old girl in Chernihiv Oblast. But the main problem of these trials is that they are taking place in absentia. So those perpetrators are still enjoying their peaceful life in Russia, or they are still in the front line. The demand for justice is one of the highest nowadays in Ukraine. And I really believe that together with international partners, our Western partners, we could bring justice to survivors and to Ukrainian people in general. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much from that. We now turn towards Dr. Buckley.
Thank you so much. My screen. There we go. Is that visible to everybody? Great. Thank you so much. First of all, I'd really like to thank the organizers of this webinar. I think it's an incredibly important topic, but moreover, I'm extraordinarily honored to be here with such an esteemed group of scholars and public activists. I come at this not as a Ukrainian woman and not having the ground experience in the last year in Ukraine, but rather I come at this as a social demographer to look at how displacement factors that we are able to observe with the invasion of Ukraine.
Cindy, I think we're having a problem with your audio.
Oh dear. Okay.
Okay, that sounded better.
Is that better?
Yeah.
Okay. I'll move closer to the new mic. Never get a new mic. Okay. Is that better? Is that functional?
Better.
But thank you so much. So we'll forget that and do it this way. Sorry about that. As I said before, this is really an honor to be with such an amazing group of female activists and scholars whose work has really changed not just our knowledge of women in Ukraine, but our approaches to gender issues more generally. I come at this not as someone with extensive on-the-ground information from Ukraine, but as a social demographer. What I'd like to talk about very quickly today is how the massive displacement that is associated with that is associated with the invasion, the escalation of the invasion 1 year ago has disproportionately influenced women as mothers, as wives, as caregivers within families, as well as women as individuals. And I'll end with a few ideas about how this experience of displacement and its repercussions may raise specific challenges to Ukrainian women in the future. No, there we go. So one of the things about displacement overall globally is that it is a complete chaos of categorization. We talk about asylum seekers, refugees, internally displaced people, the displaced, as if those categories really are reflective of lived experience. But in essence, they are tasks of legibility. The legibility of displacement from Ukraine is fraught with difficulties. And part of this has to do with the fact that we are looking at a uniquely large displacement due to warfare, but we're also looking at a unique case in which neighboring countries were able to very quickly set up visa-free entry and offer registration to people who were fleeing the country. It's also unique in Ukraine because Ukraine already had some fairly substantial administrative experience dealing with the earlier Russian incursions into Donbass. Since 2014, Ukraine had been building internal infrastructure and expertise to deal with internally displaced people. This really assisted, I think, getting up and running so that we could get some estimates of displacement, either external or internal, even though the flow of displaced people were unprecedented. The numbers and the rapidity with which the attacks to the north, to the east, and to the south generated displacement was undocumented previously, especially in Europe. And so we're looking at a huge outflow of population, but what that generated is a rapid inflow of returnees back. Just this morning, many of us got the notification from IOM of their third returnee report. And in their estimates, based on border crossings and other sources of indirect information, is that over 20% of those who have left Ukraine have returned to the country. And again, this is a unique and unprecedented experience with large-scale population migration and displacement. And I think the Ukrainian case has a lot to show the world about displacement. And it will be a focus for studies for years to come. A few things that are unique. In Ukraine, some displacement is somewhat easier to track because housing is a right. It is a right in the Constitution. Because of privatization, the majority of Ukrainians owned housing, and therefore were much more likely to be legible as displaced. Moreover, in March of 2022, the Rada very bravely put forth their first compensation law to try and get people who had lost housing some sort of avenues for preliminary compensation. Now, every report I've read points out the flaws in this program. People are not necessarily overly happy about this program, but from a demographic standpoint, just starting and opening up registration for people to potentially get compensation in the future is a boon to getting a better idea of the size of displacement and the number of people displaced. An additional asset demographically in terms of facing this very, very difficult population is the fact that we have legal border crossings. This enables better counts. There are some cases, although Moldova has done an amazing job and has the largest refugee population per capita of all of Ukraine's neighbors, they have had some problems keeping numbers, where in Poland and Romania, some of the registration programs seem to be fairly efficient in terms of people leaving the country. It's less legible in terms of those who come back. Social welfare opportunities, both for IDPs in Ukraine as well as refugees in neighboring countries, also provide an opportunity to give us a little bit more legibility. Not every person who migrated out of Ukraine during the higher escalation of conflict after February of last year has registered as a refugee. There were already tens of thousands of Ukrainians working as temporary laborers in Western Europe before the escalation in February of 2022. So while some of these social welfare opportunity registrations give us a little bit of information on the numbers, again, it's not going to be a complete picture. Things that really challenge legibility include duration of displacement, and the efficiency with which people are looking at folks who travel into the country and then return out of the country, whether they're double counted or whether they're simply taken off the rolls of refugees overall. So there's still huge definitional challenges to think about. But this is all about categorization and numbers. It really doesn't give us the lived experience. And the lived experiences are complex and they defy basic counting approaches. There is ongoing targeting by Russia of humanitarian infrastructure, be that healthcare, transportation networks, or water works. And that targeting, particularly of civilian housing, has led to the massive push for displacement. Most people have multiple displacements. In July of 2022, IOM estimated that a full third of all internally displaced people in Ukraine had actually now been experiencing their second or higher order displacement, many of them having suffered through the earlier years of the Donbass conflict. January 23rd, IOM reports really highlight the fact of multiple returns. People are crossing borders in and out of hot zones within the Ukrainian boundaries, but also crossing boundaries internationally. So again, the lived experience is, yes, I'm a refugee. Yes, I want to go back and check on my property or my relatives or my friends or my husband. But this mobility makes things really difficult. And moreover, I think there's an issue about selectivity and the way in which lived experiences vary by the type of households or the members of a specific households. Remember that there are many people who are mobility impaired, maybe because of chronic diseases, maybe because of literal mobility impairment. They find it harder to flee regions. Until recently, IOM's approach to counting internal displacement meant that you had to leave the region you were originally resident in. You needed to cross at least some sort of administrative border. For people who are highly mobility impaired and living in the bombed out remnants of households, they tended to be excluded from IDP counts. So again, the lived experience of displacement and the actual counting of displacement really show a great gulf of interpretation. An additional problem that we need to think about in Ukraine is the widespread pattern of fostering of children. In many cases, we're finding in Poland, from reports on the ground by tremendous Ukrainian demographers, there are multiple cases of children who are fostered and taken to neighboring countries, oftentimes traveling with a parent who then returns to Ukraine. The fostering of children may go along kinship lines, it may be associated with neighbors, but what that does is lead to a point of fractured families, not broken, never broken, not shattered and never shattered, but families who have been fractured. And as we think about returns and displacement, it's the cost and the pain of that fracturing, but also how we build institutions to help heal them that are important as we think about the prospects for displaced return. So I'm going to focus now just on IDPs, the internally displaced in Ukraine. And as we can see across the extant 12 surveys of the general population surveys done by IOM. These are cell phone surveys that do try their best to be representative. But again, as we can't really count the population, there's no assurance of representativity. But what we find is that among adults they are able to contact who self-identify as IDPs, the majority of them across all time periods. These have been done about once a month since the beginning of the Russian escalation of the invasion. We see the majority of people who identify as IDPs are female. The highest feminization tended to be during the summer. Now it's very close to within the confidence interval, so it's hard to say how strongly. feminized the IDP population is. But as of round 12, and this was in early January of 2023, we're talking about 55% of self-proclaimed IDPs are female as opposed to 45% being male. And this kind of imbalance in terms of accentuating the feminization of the internally displaced population also goes across, interestingly enough, all age groups, although the significance of the difference among children is not high. It's not surprising that older IDPs tend to be feminized simply because of the life expectancy differential between men and women. But of course, among adults, and these are for internally displaced people, again, it's a highly feminized group that women tend to identify as IDPs much more than men. Part of this is because men are in conscription. Part of this is because men oftentimes stay in regions that have compromised housing, as opposed to women who tend to leave with their children. When we look at children from 5 to 17, so really a pretty broad age group, we're still seeing many more female children being in IDP households as opposed to male children. So what does this all mean about the experience of women and displacement during the Russian invasion? In January of 2023, IOM reported, took self-reported needs for those who were identified as IDPs and put the data out by gender and house and displacement type. So we have non-internally displaced, we have internally displaced, and interestingly enough, because the return flow of refugees is so large, they were also able to estimate male returnees and female returnees. Across a variety of needs, and I want to point out 3 in particular, we find that it is female IDPs who tend to, almost across every category, save building materials and solid fuel, tend to have the highest percent of their group reporting that they have unmet need. They have unmet financial needs, they have unmet clothing needs, most definitely unmet health needs. And oftentimes this is associated with children in the household and women being internally displaced with children. Back of the envelope calculations, because these data just came out, and preliminary findings I want to stress, show that female-headed IDP households are between 2 and 3 times more likely to contain children under 18. They are between 6 to 9 times more likely to contain children under 5. And so the needs of these IDP households that are headed by women are immense, and it's not surprising that we're seeing higher rates of reported financial need and health need. This is particularly difficult for IDPs simply because of the extraordinary stress that social services are under in Ukraine, but also links into an issue about refugees. Earlier in the chat, someone posted a question about child deportations into Russia from Ukraine, and this is a really serious topic. There have been changes in adoption laws. There has been a lot of rhetorical claims about saving Ukrainian children that certainly link into genocidal claims made against the Russian Federation. But when we think about healthcare, we also need to think about what's happening to children who are fostered. In the fog of war, very rarely were people able to fill out proper legal paperwork to give a custodian full rights to make medical decisions or even travel across another border. And so what we're finding now are just some sporadic reports from the Czech Republic, from Poland, from Romania, of children who need medical assistance, but they are not with a custodial parent. And whoever the custodian is doesn't have the proper paperwork to pursue healthcare for them. This is true for vaccinations. It's also true for more low-scale healthcare needs. And so this is another issue that really is wrapped up in gender and displacement. So I want to wrap up now with thinking about the big picture of displacement, return, and demography. The Ukraine case of female displacement raises specific concerns and consequences. This is particularly true in terms of healthcare for women, access to reproductive health care across all categories of reproductive health, but also the idea that with female displacement, you have caretaker displacement. And so women-headed households are taking care of children, and from preliminary numbers, it appears also much more likely to be taking care of elderly IDPs. To enable returns with infrastructure and housing will be a daunting task. And it is certainly something that will be the first order of importance once the conflict ends. Family reunification issues are likely in the Ukraine case to lead to higher rates of return. IDPs will go home. Many of them report, indeed, a full 37% of them report that their entire household was not displaced, but that part of the household left. And so that will increase the probability that family reunification will have a positive impact on return rates, with many more people coming back to their original locations in Ukraine or back to Ukraine from abroad. At the same time, ecological issues, extensive land minings, particularly in the east, and problems with transport are really key. So when peace is obtained or there is a cessation in Russian aggression, these are the issues that really need to be put up most quickly. I want to wrap up with one final thought, and this comes from the Hurry conference last week at Harvard, where one of the assistant mayors of Kyiv graciously shared some insights into the way in which the capital city is looking at rebuilding in the long run. They are really focused on the demographic concerns of the Ukrainian state. Fertility has been below replacement for quite some time. And as they rebuild, they want to focus much more on young families and make housing that is more hospitable to families and fertility. This is a wonderful idea, but at the same time, I think it leaves us with a question that may incorporate some of the comments from our fabulous group here. And that is, will this push and this concern for fertility in the post-war period put an additional burden on women, or indeed, will it really help us understand women's position better? Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for that. Jessica, you're up.
Greetings. Dobry den всім. I will begin my presentation about culture and education inside Ukraine today with a quote by a good friend and a literary author from Ukraine named Yevgenia Belarusets. And after I read the quote, I'll explain what it is from. I think everyone has the right to think and talk about the war. It is our common pain, the common pain of all humanity. The whole world is, in a sense, responsible for what is happening. This is an act of violence, bloodshed, brutality, and genocide. Anyone, anywhere in the world must connect with this. If somebody has traveled out of Ukraine for whatever reason, but feels it is necessary to talk about it, let her speak. I think those are very powerful words. This is from a text called War Diary that Yevgenia was creating during the first 41 days of the all-scale invasion of Ukraine. Every day writing in Ukrainian and then having her text translated daily by publishers in different countries, Germany, the US, and also China into Chinese. So reaching very, very wide, diverse audiences with her firsthand experiences living in Kyiv while the war was going on in the first 41 days. This text then went to the Venice Biennale, and she traveled there this year to represent Ukraine on the international platform of artists there. What does this mean in wartime? It's a really ancient question going back to Greece and the 20th century mass killings of artists in Ukraine for expressing sentiments of nationalism, quote unquote, by Soviets. What is the role of art during a war and culture during a war? While Russia targets museums, schools, universities, now Ministry of Education lists 2,000 educational institutions shelled or totally destroyed. This is more than just ideology. This is the attempt to destroy identities, communities, cohesion. And the response to that is both an impulse to preserve, but also in the act of preserving, a new culture is created. And the cultures and the engagements that cultural workers and artists and museums are working on right now, what we're seeing is becoming more and more globalized. As Yevgenia points out, this is the common pain of all humanity. Everyone has a right to speak and should speak and find and connect with what is going on in Ukraine. So oftentimes when I'm working and teaching students about Ukraine, they're really afraid, especially if they're in the US and they have no immediate connection to Ukraine. They're afraid to say the wrong thing. I want to share my screen because I want to show you an exhibit that I worked on this year with artists who were making art all year about Ukraine. These are the artists on the right. You can see the name first of this exhibit, I Have a Crisis for You, Women Artists of Ukraine Respond to War. Early on in the war, media was talking about it as a crisis, essentially censoring the event as a war, in part, maybe in appeasement to Putin's internal policies in the Russian Federation. And this is a comment about that, but it's also a quote from the book Apricots of Donbass by award-winning poet Lyuba Yakimchuk, who performed actually at the Grammys this year in the US. We didn't know that before we created our exhibit, but here let me just show you, made a kind of toolkit with artists and cultural institutions in Ukraine, meaning me and my co-curator, Grace Mahoney, and we got sponsors from 7 departments at University of Michigan. The first one is the Institute for Research on Women and Gender, and we installed it into an atrium, reproducing the works to make it very cost-effective and very visible, because thousands of students pass through here every week. It's not in a side room or a gallery where you have to pay for tickets. And the artists were all creating their works about women's experiences during the war and created them in 2022. So these were not prior works. These are, you might call them documentations, you might call them images that simply express an experience. We worked with different media. Here you can see watercolor, but also photography. This is J.T. Blatty's work. She had been working training volunteer combatants because she herself is a veteran, and she also is a professional photographer and was photographing some of the volunteers in the first defense of Kyiv. Actually, these are all from the Kyiv volunteer units. Here you will see also sort of mythical references again to ancient Greece, collective graves, genocide being something that happens and appears again and again throughout time. And we are, I think, invited by these artists to look again at women's experiences of this violence. Here in these images, you see a lot of loneliness and loss represented. And you can also see different years being listed. There's a historicity to these works that are also not only part of this exhibit, but they've been now shown in Poland, Germany. Also, I mentioned Venice Biennale, and Kinderalbum was part of Venice Biennale. So a lot of the, images and the artists themselves have been working on this material since 2014. So even though these works were created in 2022, often using, again, just like Evgenia Belarusets, the form of a visual or diary, a journal, they have been part of brokering a lot of NGO work in near the front lines. In particular, Severodonetsk and Mariupol became cultural hubs in 2015, and from 2015 to 2022, when it was much safer to be there than it is now, there were art residencies there, and some of the focus of those art residencies were actually about gender and LGBT rights. So it's interesting that these frontline responses by artists to the war early on were taking on such, socially, I guess, progressive and even controversial ideas. It was important at that time, and still is, and I want to just get to this page, to look at the institutions behind the art, to look at the process of how these images are created, because a lot of the cultural, as I mentioned, cultural preservation and cultural production are happening at the same time. So in a smaller scale NGO grassroots level, in which more of the activists in the gender and feminist communities have been working, rather than the cultural heritage of UNESCO or the national museums, which are doing a lot of things right now, and I can touch on some of those as well. But today I wanted to share the grassroots cultural initiatives that have a history in Ukraine already. You have things like Free Filmers of Mariupol, and they have not been destroyed despite what the city has gone through. And they actually didn't form in 2022. This is a team of artists who have been working together since 2015, largely led by Oksana Kazmina, who's a little bit older than the others in here in their generation. But what is really interesting, and I think important for students and faculty in the US who may be listening to this, to know about these NGOs, is they're eager and interested to work with others abroad. And the virtual world has given us so many tools now to connect. So Free Filmers of Mariupol also was connected to the TU platform, which is still operating. And they, during the pandemic, had a virtual residency for women artists called Woven Network, like a woven thread, with textiles being a traditional, form of art for women throughout time. They took, I think it was 5 artists from Ukraine into this residency and 15 from around Western and Central Europe. And it was 6 months online meetings and workshops, and then a digital online exhibit that was open access. Anybody could access it. So this has still and is a working model in the wartime that I think is a very resilient one and effective, because creating cluster networks that are international right now for Ukrainian artists in displacement, it also provides them with resources, and those resources usually are reinvested back to those who are in Ukraine, who are the most vulnerable in the free filmers of Mariupol case. But here also I'm showing Iglio, Help LGBTQI People. Iglio is the oldest NGO that works with LGBTQI queer individuals in Ukraine, and they also have been central in the smaller scale grassroots cultural work. Ukraine Art Emergency Fund is also doing a lot, and they work right now with the initiative to create a Motsak in Kyiv, a modern art museum or a contemporary art museum in Kyiv in the future. So artists, being visionaries, also have the impetus to focus on the rebuilding of Ukraine, and one area of that right now, of that energy, is to create a contemporary art museum, state-supported, in Kyiv. These are just more, organizations that I've worked with personally, that work with a lot of refugees in Poland and Eastern Europe. Beyond this exhibit, and why I'm focusing on this landing page, is because I think that, right now on university campuses, the outside, the global world, or the beyond Ukraine, outside of the border of what's happening, is playing a really important role in institutionalizing some of the ideas that before the war were not really welcome in a lot of the more mainstream institutions. So there's been a kind of mainstreaming now of gender rights, gender equality, LGBT, that, in my view, and what I've seen with bills put on the table for marriage equality in Ukraine in recent years, compared to what had been put on the table prior to 2022, what I'm seeing is actually a rapid sort of advancement to the ideals, the original ideals of what maybe the EU would have liked to stand for, and that there's even an outpacing of reform to what might be compared with feminism and gender in nearby Poland, for example, where you have not seen a liberalization of marriage equality or abortion laws. You've seen the opposite still in the context of the war. So there can be on the surface assumptions still that EU is more progressive and more supportive of culture and art, and there's more opportunity, and Ukraine should go in that direction, when actually that's not always true on the level of cultural development and openness and acceptance to marriage equality. There are some things and some areas in Ukraine that are outpacing many European countries. And so I think what activists within the LGBT and feminist communities that are also sometimes identical, those activists can be identical to visual arts communities and activists, because visual arts communities in Ukraine for the last 10 years have been working with a lot of NGOs around issues connected to censorship and access to resources, again, in the more mainstream institutions, to support their own art, to have artists run spaces that they control, rather than depending on, a central authority to control the artist run space or an oligarch supported museum. Yes, Victor Penchuk is a rather benevolent figure for art, and has really supported a lot of great artists and initiatives in Ukraine. I'm not speaking on his behalf or anything. And artists are critical of that as well, though, as a monopoly on what might be able to otherwise open up and free space for for smaller independent institutions and pedagogical institutions for younger artists or younger culture makers. I don't want to take up all the time, so I will just end
Jessica, I wonder if you could put the link here for everyone in the chat, and then we have a someone who's been viewing that has a similar link from Purdue that I'll put on there, and then we can move on to Oksana.
Okay, sure. Great. Yes. And as I post that, I will just mention that in the educational sector, we have, through Fulbright, been working on SUDUS, which is called Strengthening Ukraine's Displaced Universities Sustainability. And that program works with 14 administrators, 14 universities administrators from the that have been displaced from Luhansk, Donetsk, and Crimea. So I could talk a little bit more about that in the Q&A, but I won't get to that now. So thank you.
Thank you. Oksana, and we'll go over a little bit, so just take whatever time you need.
Okay, thank you. Before I start, I will share my screen so you can follow whatever I'm talking about. And in addition to this, let me post in the chat some information. I really sincerely ask you to consider possible donations to some volunteer humanitarian organizations. If you can make any contribution, will be highly appreciated. So here is my screen. I'll try to share it now. And then I'll proceed discussing yet another aspect of women's experiences of this Russian war against Ukraine. I'm going to speak about women's volunteer movement in Ukraine. Actually, if asked what Ukrainian women do in this war, one can respond with confidence. They do everything. Women are everywhere, and they participate in the defense efforts in all possible roles and ways. And today I will focus only on one dimension of women's activities, women's volunteer movement at the home front. The revolution of dignity and subsequent Russian war against Ukraine since 2014 gave birth to a real grassroots volunteer movement in which women took lead in terms of membership and leadership. The recent full-scale invasion of Russian army prompted hundreds of thousands of women to join such activities all over Ukraine. The volunteer activism began on Maidan, and over 80 years evolved into a nationwide massive movement with virtually everyone involved in one way or another. Recent sociological surveys show that up to 80% of Ukrainians either volunteer or donate to volunteers and army. And every third young person, 16 to 24 years old, volunteer on the regular basis, and up to 60% take part in volunteer activities occasionally. One should be aware that the post-Soviet Ukrainian society was pretty much spoiled with paternalist attitude towards the state, expecting the state institutions, either government or local authorities, to provide, to solve issues, to take care of, to decide, as people perceive themselves powerless and deprived of agency. So, the most of the humanitarian initiatives and organizations that operated in Ukraine since the 1990s very oftentimes affiliated with some religious groups or churches or political parties, and actually use charity to disseminate their beliefs or ideologies and recruit new members. So it was not the volunteer movement per se, and it took us a long time to accept and adopt the ideas and practices of volunteering, unpaid work, or activity for community or a certain vulnerable social group aimed to solve specific pressing issues or satisfy some needs. Since 2014, women's volunteer initiatives were focused predominantly on supporting the army, providing the soldiers with literally everything from uniforms and food up to some non-lethal military equipment. One cannot but notice that the driving force of those initiatives were women with personal relationship to the soldiers, their wives, mothers, sisters, or widows, being really vocal and persistent in their criticism and demands to the state, Those volunteers contributed greatly to positive changes in the Ukrainian army. After 8 years of intense activism, many became real experts in what concerns army needs and were able to advise to state authorities and army commandership. On the other hand, Ukrainians have a strong legacy of women's charity practices, including all kinds of relief initiatives in times of World War I, both in Galicia and the Austro-Hungarian Empire and in Central and Eastern Ukraine under Russian Empire. Ukrainian women's groups provided versatile help to refugees, prisoners of war, wounded, widows and orphans and others. At that time, however, those initiatives were launched and operated by established women's organizations and consisted mainly of the well-educated urban women from privileged social groups. Let's have a closer look on the present-day women's volunteer movement in Ukraine and focus on the activities of women's informal self-organized groups that use their gendered knowledge, skills, and competence as much-needed resources for the defense effort. I will explore three major aspects of those activities: reproductive work, care work, and emotional labor, which are usually considered part and parcel of so-called normative femininity. Remarkably, from the first days of the full-scale Russian aggression, informal groups of women popped up spontaneously in all possible settings, from workplace to private houses, to do something meaningful for our victory. Oftentimes, women combined their household knowledge and skills in cooking, sewing, knitting, with professional expertise and managerial experiences. So some took the lead to arrange the process efficiently, from acquiring raw materials and of proper quality and quantity, distributing specific operations, organizing work shifts, up to delivery of final products. Those women's groups benefited greatly from their own personal social networks of family, neighbors, co-workers, and friends to get the job done. Remarkably, the kind of work these women do as volunteers is usually perceived as very mundane, trivial chores, so-called reproductive work. Women usually do that at home for their families on a day-to-day basis. But because of the large scale of production, the public purpose of such activities, and the collective nature of the entire affair, the meaning of these activities changes drastically as it becomes a socially significant work. Thus, the limits between the so-called private sphere and the public sphere, as well as the distinction between the reproductive and productive work, are blurred. Besides of these reproductive activities, in early March, when distressed IDPs fleeing from the endangered places started to come into central and western Ukrainian cities and towns in big numbers, common local women quite spontaneously get involved in care work to arrange about accommodation, food, clothes, basic necessities. It turned out that majority of public shelters opened up in schools, kindergartens, institutions of culture, community centers, where the necessary facilities like kitchens and bathrooms exist. And the absolute majority of personnel there are women. Women usually took over the responsibility for running those shelters, with no support from state or local authorities on the private donations only, at least at the first stage of the war, full-scale aggression. In many instances, women volunteers proved to be efficient managers, fundraisers, multitask workers, logisticians, and communicators, dealing with the refugees directly and using gendered knowledge and skills. These women's volunteers were able to identify and assess the major needs of their dependents and to use their available resources sensibly. Those very gendered knowledge and skills proved women to be indispensable in sorting out and distributing humanitarian aid when it started to come from abroad in bulk, but rather disordered form. Women were able to identify appropriate foodstuff and to calculate its amount for various target groups, to select proper clothing, to think through other necessities people might need, even to figure out prescriptions for basic medicine, because this is what they usually do on the daily basis for their family members. Such upscaling from routine home chores to community service And the high demand for this type of competency turned women into indispensable specialists possessing important expertise. One should be aware that sometimes the types of care work entail serious risk for personal safety and therefore demanded substantial courage, persistence, emotional stability, physical endurance, communication skills, and many other not so feminine features, which female volunteers efficiently combined with so-called feminine empathy, compassion, and patience. I mean, taking care of or evacuating vulnerable and really helpless people or abandoned animals from endangered places is a mission for those who really care and who are truly strong at the same time. Usually media and scholars tend to focus on large-scale events, institutionalized activities, or some vivid phenomena, while grassroots, small-scale, or individual initiatives and activities that take place in informal settings too often go unnoticed and unappreciated. Here I want to draw your attention to emotional labor women do as an integral part of their care work without registering it as a specific type of job, because this is a part of a normative femininity to provide emotional support and to ensure psychological comfort of family members. Women are trained to be like home therapists, and many are really good in that. Many local female artists and cultural workers offered IDPs, both adults and kids, all kinds of educational and creative activities that in fact worked as art therapy and helped traumatized people to deal with their distress, to distract from heavy thoughts, to experience positive emotions, and to recover mentally. Empathy is not something measurable. The amount of personal resources or mental energy women invest in emotional labor cannot be calculated. The effect of this work is not necessarily palpable. Of course, this is a way too early to make any final generalizations on women's experiences of volunteer activities at the war, as the war is ongoing and we really don't know how long it might take and how much effort it might need. A full-scale research is necessary to understand this phenomenon comprehensively, but some preliminary observations could be made on the basis of information from the open sources, even today. Besides rather obvious prevalence of women in humanitarian initiatives in terms of numbers, women also prevail in terms of leadership. They are those who initiated and who actually managed the groups organizing their activities overall, while men contribute in some auxiliary roles, like drivers, loaders, or guards. The large scale and high intensity of some volunteer activities are really impressive, as they work oftentimes 24/7, or full working week with a big number of people involved and processes coordinated, and enormous turnover of goods and services and funds. So even the most mundane cooking or sewing could turn into a well-managed business with all the elements from investment to delivery efficiently coordinated. This is a great school of entrepreneurship for those who never tried and for those who did. Importantly, too often it is an all-women's business organized in rather informal way as a non-hierarchical, horizontal networking based on delegated responsibilities of its members. A kind of natural self-sorting of women's involvement in various initiatives is also quite obvious, as oftentimes younger women with better education and wider social contacts and better skills with technologies would rather engage in information and communication work and fundraising, while simple women from countryside, let's say, from small towns, more willingly offer their exquisite cooking and sewing skills. The point is that anyone could find her way to contribute, and anyone's input is appreciated. Women learn to deal with authorities and to collaborate with businesses, working around all kinds of difficult obstacles. A strong sense of solidarity and augmented self-esteem and self-confidence should definitely result from such activities. And many so-called apolitical women actually obtained their first experiences in public activism and community service. Very important feature of women's volunteer activities is their inclusiveness, as women of various age, social standing, income level, ethnicities, education, and so on, oftentimes work together, sharing duties and complementing whatever resources they have at their disposal, financial, social, material, or skills. Elderly women and those with disabilities are also included, as they could do most routine work from their homes, while younger help with bringing raw materials and picking up final products. Due to enormous efforts women invest in these activities, many female volunteers already report serious fatigue, some health issues caused by physical and emotional burnout, while recent outrageous cases of charges pressed against some volunteers for alleged misuse of funds could present women with yet another stress factor. I'm trying to emphasize the instrumental use of resources rooted in the normative femininity, gender-based knowledge, skills, and proficiency as efficient tools to deal with actual challenges when other conventional resources and opportunities are extremely limited or unavailable. I consider women's reproductive and care work, as well as their emotional labor, as specific forms of female historical agency when other avenues to actively engage in public life are restricted. I do not claim that modern women active citizenship should be limited to these gendered practices only, but when the society finds itself in a deep crisis and the normal life is substantially undermined, many women would turn to normative femininity as something familiar and reliable, whereas they feel really strong, qualified, and confident to use it as, so to say, power source, providing them with much needed resources for their resilience, strength, and basically for their grassroots agency. Women's care work and emotional labor work actually as shock absorbers, helping to stabilize the shaken society so it stays on tracks, keeps operating in a survival mode. My point is to bring attention to women's gender-specific responses, behaviors, and practices scholars, policymakers, and even community members tend to overlook in the past and continue to underestimate today. I am perfectly aware that modern women have a wide variety of ways to be active citizens and effectively participate in the events that unfold in Ukraine. As a feminist scholar, however, I encourage us to think beyond the androcentric paradigm, which tend to favor and appreciate so-called male-dominated spheres and activities like military, politics, and business, while neglecting and depreciating women's traditional domains, activities, and pursuits. We cannot afford to perceive those elements of normative femininity which many women unconditionally, even if uncritically, embrace and embody as something disempowering and adverse or opposite to women's agency. We cannot just discard those traditional women who never challenged their normative femininity. If we feminists maintain that scornful attitude towards traditional women depreciating their work, we only contribute to building hierarchies among women themselves. On the contrary, we need to change our perspective and properly acknowledge the importance of reproductive and care work and emotional labor women perform on a daily basis within the so-called private sphere or on the community level. It turned out that those skills, knowledge, and practices represent something incredibly valuable and powerful when the society goes through the major crisis. I hope this war just make us more aware of women's contribution to the war efforts, no matter how mundane or trivial they might look. And we have to properly appreciate both during the war and after the victory. And I hope that women will be able to convert those newly acquired experiences into political capital and sustainable institutional changes. Thank you.
Wonderful. Well, thank you all for 4 just fabulous talks, a lot of things to think about, to ponder, and really, really important things to bring to the fore. We are, I'm losing my light, but we are actually past time, but if we can get our panelists to stay a few more minutes, I think we might be able to address a question or two, and then we will wrap up if that's okay with our panelists. We have a couple of questions here in the chat, and if you have others that you'd like to add, we may get to them. But I wanted to start with Marta. There is a question about genocide and how we might think about sexualized violence as genocide or ethnic cleansing, those sorts of words that are thrown around a lot. Will this fit into this, and how should we think about it in the Ukrainian context?
Thank you so much. Basically, I think that we could consider sexual violence perpetrated by Russian soldiers as a means of genocide. Why? Because as feminist scholars like Cynthia Card in 1990s pointed out, there is more than one way to commit genocide. And one of these many ways to commit genocide is sexual violence. Why? Because sexual violence disrupts the social order and gender order. We know nowadays then that in Kherson Oblast, for example, Russian soldiers invaded houses of Ukrainian military men and pick up their women, mostly their daughters, their sisters, their wives, precisely for rape, because they want to harm them, first of all. And these kind of violence really interrupt gender order and social order. We know that some women experience victim blaming. Some women, because of victim blaming, should leave their communities, especially when they are living, for example, in countryside, in small communities where everyone knows everyone. Even Victoria, that I mentioned previously, she complained about this victim blaming attitude in her community in Kiev region. So basically, I really believe that sexual violence could be, in terms of Russian war against Ukraine, considered as genocide. And one more point: in many cases, we observe genocidal language during the act of violence, when women are labeled as Nazi whores, as boundaries, as Ukrainian women, and so on, so on. So clear ethnical, and national labeling is present here. So yes. Thank you so much for this important question.
Thank you. For Oksana and Jessica, there are a couple of questions about the grassroots movements that you both have talked about in different areas. Have you noticed that these have become institutionalized or nationalized, or have they stayed predominantly localized? And then an additional kind of add on that is, are women being specifically sought for their skills or their talents in these regards?
Thank you for this question. In order to answer it, we really need some generalized data. We don't have them yet. What I can speak only from the point of observation, whatever is available in the public open sources. What I see that many actually initiatives remain local and very informal, without any official registering as NGOs or whatsoever. And quite many of them are not that big in terms of leadership, but they are like wide networks of women who contribute in different ways to specific initiatives. So there is a kind of core group which take the lead, organizing everything, and there are many other women who contribute in different ways and help to solve specific questions or issues or problems whenever it's necessary. So it's like different from those initiatives we know about very well. I mean, like Pretula Fund and other funds. Maybe the only exception is this, but it is based in the US, Razum for Ukraine, which is a huge organization and operates.
I want to just to assign 2 books for further reading. One is called Without the State, Self-Organization and Political Activism in Ukraine, published on University of Toronto Press 2022. Author is Emily Channel Justice, scholar of Ukraine, currently based at Harvard. She documents there a lot of the activism leading up to the war. Civilian, not volunteer for military, but a different type of activism. And my book, too, documents a lot of that: Superfluous Women, Feminism, Art, Revolution in Ukraine. more within education and culture, but also specific feminist LGBT groups. In terms of mainstreaming of this area, I can, if you're interested in tracking data on that, I recommend Tamara Marcinyuk's research. She's based at Keith Mohila, anthropologist. Again, as Dr. Keith said, a lot is changing rapidly, and we don't have the data to make the projections we need to, but there's a lot of work that's already been done. And I think reading also Dr. Keith's work too will give you an incredible foundation to understand what existed from the beginning of the war, which was 2014, not 2022, because a lot of the trends are continuous. 2022 didn't just break and destroy everything. Those communities still are continuing to work, and it's good to know about them.
Right. Thank you for those recommendations. And then our viewers will note in the chat that some organizations have been listed. So please do take a look at those. And then just to wrap up, we have one final question. Cynthia, we'll throw this one to you. Given some of the political and economic problems that Ukraine experienced prior to the invasion, do you believe that they will be returning or at some point have a stable peace or a stable government and economy once peace is reestablished?
Well, I think a stable government.
I'm sorry, you're gonna have to, your microphone is
off again. I think a stable economy, stable government. No.
Well, now you've put yourself on mute.
Okay, here we go. I think a stable government and economy is a desire of many people in many places.
All right.
Can't do it.
Sorry about that. We can't. Technology is fabulous until it isn't. But perhaps I know you had some comments and thoughts on it. If you want to take a minute and add it into the Q&A for their guests that asked that. So we will go ahead and wrap up. Thank you so much to our wonderful panelists. I think Oksana perfectly summed this up when she said, if you want to know where women in the war are, they are everywhere. That is absolutely 100% the case. So thank you so much for giving your time, your labor, sharing these important stories, your stories, others' stories with us here today. And I'll pass it along to my colleague, Melissa Stockdale, to close us out.
I would just like to repeat those thanks. I learned so much today, and I hope that the hundreds of people who were watching will learn as well. And I just want to tell people that this panel has been recorded, and in a few days, it will be posted to the YouTube channel of the College of International Studies. So those who would like to rewatch or who could only catch part of the program, it will be there for you. Thank you so much for coming, and thank you again to our wonderful panelists. Have a great day.